Good morning. The scripture reading from God's Word this morning is taken from Mark chapter 9, verses 33 through 37, subtitled The Greatest in the Kingdom, reading from the New Living Translation. After they had arrived at Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked his disciples, "What were you discussing out on the road?" But they didn't answer because they had been arguing about which of them was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12 disciples over to him, and said, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else." Then he put a little child among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me."
Good morning, everybody. I think I'm on today. Good. I've been enjoying the congregational reading plan that's been going on. I think many of the people in our congregation are involved in that. We have just kind of finished. We're at the point now where we're just finishing up the book of Acts, and I don't know if you've been following along. I encourage you to if you haven't been. It's been really good. One thing that kind of stood out to me this time, I don't know if you've ever done this, but as I was reading through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, have you ever done this when you're reading the Bible, like intentionally looking at it through a certain lens? This is sort of an exercise I tried this time, and as I was reading through the Gospels, I was looking at it through the lens, asking myself a question as I was reading. I was asking, how is Jesus making disciples? In this particular instance, in whatever story or chapter I was reading. What was he doing to take people from the point where they were maybe like a complete stranger to him to the point where they had become a dedicated follower of his? Like what kind of things was he doing along the way to make that happen? And so that was sort of the lens I was trying to look through as I was reading it. And I noticed some pretty important things, I think, as that was happening. And I would like to go through some of those with you today. And I think that's probably not my slideshow, unless you want to talk about hiking in Colorado, but just one second. That looks better. Okay. Okay, so as I was reading through the scriptures, I noticed some things that I want to share with you today. And first of all, the thing that stood out to me about how Jesus made disciples was that he kind of did it everywhere. Everywhere he went, everything he did was about helping people find and follow him. And this might happen in more kind of typical ministry settings that we might associate with ministry and spiritual growth, like in a temple, in a synagogue, helping people in those places to learn God's word, maybe people who were hurting and needed help with something. And we see an example of this in Matthew 9. It says that Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages. Can you think about that? Through all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. As you read through the Gospels, you see this come up a lot. This happens over and over. Jesus in a setting like a synagogue, in a temple, preaching the good news and serving those who needed help. And I think we can connect with that on some level, right? Today we do similar things in buildings like this, in a church building, teaching from God's word. We're familiar with that. Healing people in our own kind of way. We try to heal people too. Maybe somebody is in our midst who's hurting from some sin issue or some painful situation in their life, and we try to help them. Maybe somebody's going through a hard time and we support them. Maybe they're needing help with clothing or food or something like that, and we come to their aid in a place like this. And so we can kind of connect with what is happening here in this verse. And that's great. Much good can come from that kind of ministry and these kinds of places, and we do a lot of good to help each other grow in those things. But I also want to highlight something else that really became apparent as I looked through the Gospels with that lens. Something that really stood out for me was that in Jesus' life, his spiritual experiences, if you want to use that term, they were not limited to the synagogue or to the temple or to like a place that would normally be associated with spiritual things. For him, it was everywhere. The spiritual community for him was everywhere and always. And that's really what I would like to highlight for us this morning. This month, we've been talking about spiritual growth disciplines. That's what we're calling it. And basically, this is just things that we can do, things that we should do, things that we must do if we want to grow spiritually. We've been talking about prayer, about worship, reading the Bible, and other things like that. And so this morning, one of those things, the thing I want to talk to you about today is the idea of growing in a community. The idea of having a community of faith around you to help you grow. This is another essential thing for spiritual growth and something we need to discipline ourselves to be involved in. For Jesus, though, it was more than just being in a synagogue. And that's really the lesson I would like to highlight for us today. His faith, his experience with spiritual things, his spiritual community, it didn't have borders like that. There were no borders. And he took his faith with him everywhere. And so should we. And so this is the important idea that I want to highlight this morning. If we limit our spiritual experiences to the walls of a church building, we might also be limiting our potential for spiritual growth to the walls of the church building. And I don't think we want to do that. So I want to challenge us this morning by looking at the example of Jesus' life and how the spiritual community for him was everywhere. In synagogues, as we just looked at there, but also in campfires and coffee tables. And you might be wondering about that title. It's kind of a weird title. But I kind of found this. I saw it in the Gospels as I was reading through, and I mentioned I was making a list as I was going, and I'd like to share that with you, actually, if you want. I have a list of all those instances I found. There was 24 times, actually, in the four Gospels when Jesus was doing some kind of ministry work, either at a table in someone's house, either at a meal in someone's house, rather, or in someone's house in general. So 24 times when Jesus was helping people grow spiritually at a meal or in a home. And I thought that was just amazing. That really stood out to me, that I think that's important, that he did ministry in these kinds of everyday places. And so you might be wondering, well, why would you focus on meals and homes? But the reason why I wanted to do that was because I think it's these everyday spaces, these everyday events that we can and should see as an opportunity for spiritual growth for ourselves and our church family around us. We spend a lot of time at home, and Jesus did as well. Apparently, he spent time in a lot of different people's houses, and we can use that like Jesus did to help people grow spiritually. It's a space for spiritual growth. And we also eat. I think all of us eat at some point, and Jesus did that too. And for him, it was more than just meals, though. He used the meal, the everyday mundane things like a meal, for a chance to help people grow spiritually. And so that's the premise today. And I want us to think about that and ask the question, what would it look like for us if we followed his example and used those everyday occurrences as a chance for spiritual growth, as a chance for ministry? What could happen? How could that expand our experience with the church family and with spiritual growth? And I guess in some ways we don't really have to wonder too much about what could happen, because Jesus shows us what can happen. And that's exactly what I want to talk to you about today and go through with you. I want to look at 3 of the examples here on this screen and go through them. It's going to be not so much a sermon as sort of a Bible study. I just want to look at a few of these examples and highlight some things that Jesus was doing in everyday spaces to help people grow. So the first one is from Mark chapter 9. It's from the reading that Bob brought to us today. It's a teaching you're probably very familiar with, right? A famous teaching of Jesus. He tells the disciples to put others ahead of themselves. But you might have missed this small detail here in verse 33. Did you know that they were in a house? Were you picturing that in your mind during this conversation? I don't know whose house it was. I don't know what the setup looked like or anything like that. But it's interesting to note that this conversation, this famous, life-changing conversation was happening in someone's house. Jesus heard them. They were on the road arguing about who was the best. It was a juvenile, kind of childish argument, you could say. And you can picture the scene, right? They arrive at the house. They're sitting down. Maybe you've been in a scene like this before yourself. It's a home, a big group of people. There's kids running around, it says in there. Maybe it's a bit chaotic, but it's also real life, right? It's an everyday thing for most of us, being at home. And Jesus asked the question to the group there. He says, "What were you talking about on the road?" And he knew, right? He knew. But they don't answer. Maybe they're a bit embarrassed or something. And so then he starts teaching them this powerful lesson. In verse 35, he says, he called them over and he said, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else." And the child is going by at that time. In my mind, the child's running because, this is a house and things are chaotic. But I don't know if it was running or not. But Jesus it says taking the child in his arms in verse 36. He said to them, the disciples, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me." So he calls the 12 disciples and he says, "You know what you can do if you want to be the best? Welcome a child like this." And then he takes the child in his arms and embraces him. And you might wonder, well, what's the lesson in that? The child that he took in his arms was, well, a child, right? Not very impressive by many societal standards, not much to offer, kind of weak in terms of strength, in terms of ability. But in that, I think, is exactly the point he was trying to make. The new life in his kingdom is not about, am I better than this person? It's more about, how can I make this person better? What can I give of myself to benefit others? Not what do I have in myself that makes me better than others, right? It was a powerful lesson that he was teaching with just what was happening around him in an everyday circumstance. And I was thinking about that. How else could Jesus have handled this situation? He probably could have done a lot of things. He could have heard them arguing on the road and decided to himself, you know what? I'm going to reformat my lessons in the synagogue for the next month. We're going to start talking about humility and serving others. He could have done that, and maybe he did even. But this is highlighting a different approach that he took. He could have offered an anger management class on Tuesdays and invited them to come. But he didn't do that, right? For him, I'm trying to point out here this morning, I guess, that for him it wasn't so much about being in a certain space that is spiritual. It wasn't about a program to accomplish a spiritual goal. It was just about real life. Sitting with people right where he was and helping them grow. He sat down in a living room and helped them to see what God's will for their life was. And I think we can learn a lot from that example. And I hope you can relate to this. Thinking about our own experience, in this church family, do you know anyone who's going through a relationship struggle right now? Right? I think we could all agree that we know somebody in that. Maybe that's ourselves even. Do you know anyone who has a desire to understand more about God's will for their lives and what it looks like to live for Him? Maybe you don't have all the answers, but do you have a living room? And what I really mean by that is, do you have a willingness to sit down and talk with somebody about spiritual things? That might be the place to start. Maybe you're not ready for a conversation like that yourself, to take on a challenging topic with somebody, but maybe you could just open your home. Maybe you can start by getting involved in this kind of a campfire coffee table ministry yourself. Think about this situation that we just looked at here, right? Somebody had to open their home. Somebody had to allow Jesus and the disciples to come in and have this important conversation, and that could be you or me. How hard would it be for us to pick up the phone this week and invite a couple of people over to have a spiritual conversation? You could just ask them what stood out from the lesson on Sunday, or ask them what kind of scripture they've been looking at recently, and then go from there. It doesn't have to be complicated. But these are the ways that we can grow in community with one another. When we allow ourselves to realize that the community is everywhere and always, even in our homes, even around couches and coffee tables and campfires. So they can be powerful places for spiritual growth. And so I want to keep looking at other examples here. The second one is another really powerful one. I wish we had more time to dig into a lot of the details of it. But the next example happens, it's close to the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. Before he goes to Jerusalem to be crucified. He's actually on his way to Jerusalem when this is happening, to be crucified. He passes through a town called Jericho, and he meets a man who stood out. A man who stood out for a few reasons. The first of which is that he's up in a tree when Jesus meets him. And it happened like this. You're probably familiar with the story. In verse 1 of Luke 19, it says that Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through, and a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy, and he wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see him over the crowd, so he ran ahead and climbed into a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." The other thing you might remember about Zacchaeus and what we can see here in the text is that he was a tax collector. It actually says here he was a chief tax collector. And because of this, he was like the scum of the earth, right, to the Jewish people, his brothers and his brothers in the faith. They saw him as the worst of the worst, mainly because he was on the front lines of taking money out of the hands of his fellow Jewish people, his own people. And worse than that, he was also in charge of then giving that money to their enemies, the Romans. Ugh, what a terrible slime this man was. He was working for the enemy, and the Jews hated him for this. And Jesus, obviously, he knew all this, right? He knew who he was, but yet he looks at Zacchaeus and tells him to get out of the tree because he's coming over for lunch. That must have been a shocking scene for a lot of reasons to the people standing around. This story continues, and it takes us to a familiar place, which we can see here at the end of verse 5. It says that they went into his home. Another conversation in a home. I'm just trying to highlight a theme here, but you can see it, right? Another spiritual, life-changing conversation. And the account continues in verse 6. It says that so Zacchaeus came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." It's amazing. A life-transforming moment for this guy. And I really wish we had more of the story. I don't know what they spoke about at the house. I don't know what Jesus was able to tell him that made him do this sort of 180. Maybe it was more actually than not so much what he said, but how he treated him. Maybe it was the fact that Jesus just treated him differently than anyone else. I'm not sure. But whatever the case, we get to see the outcome, right? And it's incredible. Incredible repentance. Zacchaeus' whole life turns around that day. He makes a vow to give away half of his possessions. He makes a vow to repay anyone he's cheated with 400% interest. which is far above what the law of Moses required of him. So what can we learn from this story? Well, like I said, I wish we had more time because there's much to learn here. But today, I want to focus on the power of opening your home for ministry. For Jesus, this meal was more than just about a meal, right? It was more about than just filling his stomach, or it was more than just about being in his house. He wanted to fill Zacchaeus with a new way of life, a new purpose. And now maybe you're thinking, as I was thinking when I looked at this, I can't do this. I'm not Jesus. I can't turn someone's life around before dessert, like that's incredible. And maybe you're right about that. But this is an incredible story for us to learn from still, I think. It's not something that we're going to see happen necessarily for us on a daily basis, but just please consider a few things as well before we make the conclusion that we can't do these kinds of things. Even for Jesus, this was not a regular occurrence. Some of his meals that he sat through with maybe some of the Pharisees, for instance, if you can recall, they didn't really go this way, right? Some of them were downright awful. Sometimes the people he sat with didn't change one bit. But that didn't stop him from making himself available to the people who wanted to sit with him. And secondly, and maybe more practically for us, in other areas, we don't let Jesus' home runs deter us from getting up to the plate, right? That shouldn't be the way we look at this either. I mean, think about this. For instance, Jesus fed 5,000 people with a few loaves and some fish. I mean, we can't do that. But that doesn't stop us from trying to feed people. Jesus healed paralyzed people with a touch of his hand. We can't do that either. But that doesn't stop us from trying to care for the sick, right? Jesus helped Zacchaeus see a whole new purpose for his life over a meal. Maybe we're not going to be able to do that, at least not every time, but does that mean that we shouldn't make an effort to use our everyday occurrences, everyday meals and homes and places like this for ministry? I mean, we can follow his example in this. How difficult would it be to share a meal or share a time of conversation with someone this week? If you don't have a place of your own, it could be done in a coffee shop, a park, or some other public space. You could just tell them one thing that God's been doing in your life recently. Maybe you could invite someone who's kind of like Zacchaeus. Maybe someone who doesn't fit in very well. Maybe someone who's sort of been on the fringes of the church community for a while. And I think for parents especially, I was noticing this, that there's probably a lot of application as well for parents. Campfires and coffee tables and sorts of places like that, those everyday spaces, they may be some of the most powerful areas for ministry with your own children. I know for me, even though my parents weren't spiritually focused with me a lot, my life was transformed with them in these kinds of spaces, and I think that's the example that we can see as well in our everyday spaces today. What if it was just as simple as asking your children what you could pray about for them, or just sharing a Bible passage that you'd been thinking about through the day over dinner? It's a small thing. Maybe it won't change their life right away, but maybe over the days and weeks and months and years, using these everyday spaces and places for ministry can have a great impact on their lives. So I hope this example from Jesus' life causes us to reflect on our understanding of church a little bit, of being involved, what it means to be involved in a church community, and maybe expand that idea beyond the walls of a church building or the start and stop times of a church function. If we limit our spiritual experiences to the walls of a church building, we also will limit our potential for spiritual growth to within the walls of a church building. And I think Jesus shows us that our experience can be much more than that. The last example I want to look at comes from an early morning breakfast by the Sea of Tiberias, or also called the Sea of Galilee. This comes up in John 21. At this point, Jesus had already been crucified and been resurrected, and he had shown himself to his disciples a couple times already. This story begins with a bunch of the disciples who had gone out all night fishing, but they caught nothing. It seems that with Jesus being away, they had kind of gone back to their old ways of doing things, and maybe that's a powerful sermon for another time, but I digress. We pick up the story in verse 4 here. In John 21, it says, "Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, 'Friends, haven't you any fish?' 'No,' they answered. And he said, 'Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some.' And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It is the Lord.' And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, 'It is the Lord,' he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. And so then we continue here. In verse 9, it says that when they landed on the shore, they saw a fire of burning coals there with the fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, 'Bring some of the fish you've just caught.' So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore, and it was full of fish, 153. But even with so many fish, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, 'Come and have breakfast.' None of the disciples dared to ask him, 'Who are you?' because they knew it was the Lord." So here's another example of what we've been talking about this morning, right? Jesus using an everyday space for ministry. I mean, granted, not many of us are eating breakfast by the sea over a campfire these days. I wish I could. But it's still pretty common for us to eat breakfast, right? And we can still have breakfast with other people. Maybe the most powerful part of the story is sort of hidden in the backstory of what's going on here. If you recall the events surrounding this breakfast, you might remember that especially between Jesus and Peter, there was a lot happening. And it really brings the whole situation to life. You know, it hadn't been that long since Peter and Jesus were sharing another meal in another place together. It was the Last Supper before Jesus' crucifixion. And if you remember at that time, Peter said something very important to Jesus, and we see it here in John 13, in verse 36. Simon Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, where are you going?" And Jesus replied, "Where I'm going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." And then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." Peter made a pretty big promise here to Jesus that he was going to he was not going to deny him. He was going to lay down his life for him. But yet, in Jesus' maybe most difficult moment, when he probably needed Peter the very most, he did deny him. And not once, but 3 times. And there's no doubt that it had to have been on Peter's mind during this breakfast. There's no doubt that must have hurt Jesus, but yet here they are having breakfast together. And maybe that's a lesson right there for somebody. Maybe you're at odds with a brother or sister right now. Maybe there's something that's been said and someone's feelings got hurt, and now it's been sort of this long, awkward silence. You're both showing up for worship service. You're both trying to grow spiritually. You want to get over the issue, but nobody is talking. Maybe it's time to swallow the pride and go for breakfast together. It's amazing what God can do with a meal and 2 willing hearts. Okay, so going back to John 21, to the breakfast by the sea, even if that were the end of the story, it would already be amazing enough. But it doesn't stop there. After breakfast, there is another conversation that happens as breakfast is wrapping up. It says in chapter 21, verse 15, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." So there is a lot going on here. There's a lot we could say about the Greek language and what all of this is meaning, but that's also another sermon for another time. The point that I want to highlight this morning is that after breakfast, Jesus took Peter aside, and to parallel those 3 times that Peter denied Jesus, Jesus asked Peter 3 times about his love for him. It's a powerful moment for these two, another life-changing conversation. And because by the end of it, Jesus had called Peter to take care of his church, to take care of his sheep, another life-changing meal in the books. Nothing fancy, no fanfare, no powerful sermon, no amazing church program, no synagogue, no big event, just Jesus cooking breakfast and having a spiritual conversation in an everyday space. Peter's bright flame had grown weak, right, at this point, but his faith was faltering, but this conversation turned it all around for Peter. So how about you and how about me? Have you had a chance to speak with someone like this maybe in your life recently? Somebody who had kind of taken a step back in their faith? How did you approach that conversation? Was your invitation to them, "Hey, it's good to see you. I hope I see you again at church sometime"? I mean, I've definitely said that many times, and I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. That's a good thing. We should invite people to worship with us, and we should do that. But I think maybe this passage here is getting us to consider something else that might even be more powerful. Jesus, rather than inviting Peter to a religious event or gathering, he just simply invites Peter to himself. Instead of inviting him to a religious gathering, he just invites Peter to himself. He invites him to breakfast and to a good conversation, and it changes everything. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't invite people to events in the building. Please don't hear me saying that. I'm just saying that sometimes it might be more effective, more accessible, and even more productive for them and for us if we just simply bring the ministry of our lives to them, wherever we find ourselves together. If we limit our spiritual experiences to the walls of the building, we're also going to limit the potential for spiritual growth to the walls of the building. This is how Jesus conducted himself in his ministry. We see it all through the Gospels. For Jesus, church was not just a building, it was a community that was everywhere and always. And then it's no surprise then why we see this happening with the very first followers of his as well. In Acts 2:46, it says that every day they, being the church, continued to meet in the temple courts together. They, again, the early church, broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. We see the same example here that Jesus set with his life, right? They met together in large gatherings at the temple, and they took part in things that were going on there, and that was good. But like Jesus, their faith was also without walls, everywhere and always. They spent time in each other's homes, and they ate together, and there was something very attractive about that community because God was adding people to it every day. And I think for us, brothers and sisters, this can still be our experience today. I hope that something we've talked about this morning can be an encouragement to you. I hope that we can all see that our involvement in the church community is not just gatherings here in this place or official church events. It's also the small, everyday events of life. If we choose to use them for that purpose, where we can help each other grow spiritually. Jesus used these kinds of everyday spaces all the time, and we can too. It's how we're going to accomplish and live out commands like this in Hebrews 10:24. It says, "Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." This could be us. It must be us. And if we follow Jesus' example, it can be. I hope that you've been able to connect with one of these examples today. Maybe for you it was a conversation in the living room with the children running around. Maybe that home could be your home this week, and maybe it could be a place where life-changing conversations happen. Or maybe for you it's the story of lunch with Zacchaeus. Maybe there's someone in this church community who needs you to notice them, like Zacchaeus needed Jesus. Maybe you can share lunch with someone this week. Or maybe you can relate more with what Jesus did for Peter and the other disciples over breakfast. Maybe there's someone in this church community who has kind of had the wind taken out of their sails and needs some encouragement. Maybe there's a relationship that's strained and it needs to be repaired. Maybe it's time to have breakfast together. Whatever the case, I hope you've seen that growing together happens better in community. If we want to grow, we need to be with the church, and being together needs to be more than just being in the building once a week. As great as our gatherings here can be, there are some things that happen better around campfires and coffee tables. And I hope we'll all make an effort to engage in these kinds of ministry, in these kinds of spaces as well. Thank you for your time today.